Well done for making it so far. We're on to the home straight, the final section in the book of Ruth. And remember, the last chapter ended on a bit of a cliffhanger. Yes, they got together, but turns out, love triangle, there's somebody else in the scene. And that introduces a level of tension. And as that tension is resolved in this final chapter, what it does is it shows us wonderful truths about redemption, what redemption really means, what redemption costs, and what redemption achieves. So very much in Ruth chapter 4, although it's for them back then, firstly, and although it helps us to be more confident about David's genealogy, which is one of the purposes of the book, it very much makes links through to the New Testament, through to Jesus and his death on the cross and what he has achieved through redemption. So as we're reading it now, let's read it with that in mind. So Ruth chapter 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz says, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of the seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For none has the right to do it except you, and I am the next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you're witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The woman living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram the father of Aminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. There we go to the end of the book. Now, I've divided it up into 3 sections, and actually the 3 sections I've chosen aren't exactly the way that the book is, the final chapter is structured, but again, that helps us to get through some of the themes that we see here. And the first theme that we see is that the price is paid. And again, we've got God's providential care that Boaz very quickly, diligently goes about sorting this matter out, and he gathers together some of the elders, and then it just so happens that this other kinsman redeemer, the one who's first in line, happens to be passing by, and he gets them all together there, and he announces to them, Naomi, who's come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am the next in line. So the curious thing about the way that he sets it up, or perhaps the thing that we weren't entirely expecting, is that it just seems like a pure business venture. There's no mention about Ruth at all. It's just connected to the land. But that the land is very much tied up with the whole story. So let's just pause and think about why the land is tied up with the whole story. And I don't think we've asked this table. So do you guys want to feedback what you saw from those verses?
So part of the guardian redeemer's job is to keep the land in the family.
Yeah, exactly. So again, today we might not think of land as that important. People buy and sell, people rent, but it was all linked back to that promise. Remember, to Abraham to be God's people in God's place, enjoying God's blessing. So the land of Canaan, that land was given to them by God. It's very, very precious. And also it was divided up amongst the 12 tribes. So it couldn't change between those tribes, and it stayed within the clans as well, so that people didn't become destitute over time with no land, because their livelihood was linked to the land. And because their honor and their whole being and existence was linked to the land as well. So although you could sell land, actually selling land was really a long-term lease. So you could sell it, but that would only belong to the other person until the year of the Jubilee. The year of the Jubilee was every 50 years, the land returned to its original clan and its original owners. So you could sell it on a long-term lease, calculating the value of the land until the next year of the Jubilee. But it was much better for one of the guardian redeemers to buy that land and to keep it in the family the whole time, and to look after the widows or any of the family members who are attached to it. So that's the deal that's happening here, that Naomi is selling the land on a long-term lease, but wants to keep it in the family. So the guardian redeemer, he has first dibs on this land. And it seems like, initially, a good business proposal for him. Yes, he's going to have to look after Naomi as part of the package. He knows about that because she's the one who's selling it. But she's an older widow. It probably won't cost that much to look after her. Meanwhile, you'll get the land and you can use that and farm that and perhaps make a tidy profit. So initially, it sounds like quite a good venture. But then, rather cleverly, Boaz discloses that there is another part of the deal. And you remember what he says. On the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Now, this changes the deal completely, because Ruth is still quite young. She's not had children yet. And it seems quite likely that she will have children in the future, and this might cause some problems for him. He says over here, it might endanger my own estate. You see, he's probably thinking that now his inheritance will be split between his children and perhaps between the children that Ruth bears as well. There are more people to look after, and then the land is going to go back to Elimelech's heir, who could be born in the next few years. So he's not going to have the land for very long. So the whole deal changes a lot, and it becomes much, much more costly. And at this point, he isn't interested in doing it anymore. And so we read in verse 8, the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. Now, this removing of a sandal is a curious little detail. We're given an explanation of what it means in verse 7. There's also a reference to it in Deuteronomy chapter 25, but they don't seem to quite match up. So I thought you could have a look at that reference in Deuteronomy chapter 25. There's mention of a sandal over there, and this mention of a sandal over here, and just compare them, and are they talking about the same thing? So do some investigative work yourself there. We've managed to work roughly around the room. Do you guys want to feedback on what you discussed?
Yes, we were discussing that if there was someone who had the duty to marry their brother's or their dead brother's wife, and they didn't, then the removal of a sandal and spit in the face was almost like a humiliation, and being called the family of the unsandaled is clearly not an endearing title.
Yes. Yeah, and are there any hints about whether that's happening here or not? Did you get on to discussing that bit, or maybe not?
Not quite. But also maybe this idea that since the relative has a duty to marry and they didn't, maybe that's taking off the sandal as such, almost like humiliating himself or taking on that burden of being the unsandaled to Boaz.
Yeah, thanks. So clearly it's portrayed as something that is dishonorable, not being willing to take on the role of redeemer. And so here, this unmentioned guardian redeemer is like a foil to Boaz, just like Orpah is a foil to Ruth. So we've got these other characters who are foils to the main characters in chapter 1 and again in chapter 4. There is a little bit less drama than what's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 25. You can picture the sobbing widow coming and pulling the sandal off his feet and throwing it at him and spitting in his face. And that's a lot more drama. There's not that same kind of level of drama over here. So I wonder whether it is something perhaps a little different which is going on, and whether it's simpler to just go with the explanation that we're given in verse 7. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and he gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. That seems like the most straightforward explanation of what's going on. And Deuteronomy, it doesn't work out exactly quite like that, but Deuteronomy helps us to see that this is a dishonorable thing, that he hasn't been willing to step up because it's too costly. But Boaz, he's willing to do it even though it is costly. He says, I've acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. He's willing to do it. Now, it seems like he is a relatively well-off man. He's got his own field. He's got people working for him. But presumably some of the reasons that scared off the other guardian redeemer might also apply to him. He might also have a wife and he might also have children. It might also conflict with his property interests, but he's willing to do it. He's willing to pay the price. And so as we go from them to us, what we see is that the Redeemer has to pay a price. And of course, Jesus paid a huge price when he came to earth and died on the cross to provide redemption for the church. He took on frail human flesh and came and lived among us. He went and died a humiliating death on the cross, hugely physically painful. More than that, he took the wrath of God there to atone for sins. Isaiah chapter 53 says, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Well, here we get a little glimpse of the cost of the cross in Ruth. The other guardian redeemer doesn't want to do it, but Boaz does it, and Jesus did it, even though a huge cost to him. Can you remember him praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, preparing himself to go to the cross, in agony praying, asking that God would help him. A huge cost he paid to pay the price for our sins. See, price paid over here. And then next we see outsiders welcomed in. The deal is done, and listen to what they say. They respond and they say, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing, again, the worthy word, in Ephrathah, and be famous in Bethlehem through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman. May your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah. Well, Ephrathah is just another name for Bethlehem. That's the place where this has taken place. And we've got these comparisons with Tamar. We've already talked about that. And also Rachel and Leah. You may remember, again, imperfect story, comparisons and rivalry. But between them, they were used by God to build up the nation of Israel. And they had those 12 sons. Well, these are women who secured the family line, who've built up the family. Tamar, Rachel, Leah, and they are asking that God might make Ruth like that, someone who's used by God to secure the family line in a way which is very important. So Ruth is welcomed in, but it almost seems a little bit too easy, because we have this big problem that she is a Moabite. How can we really resolve this tension? There are bits that we've seen, and we've looked at verses already, saying, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner because you were foreigners in Egypt. So the outsiders are meant to be welcomed in a general sense. But then remember how strong these words against the Moabites are. Let's have a look at some of those. Deuteronomy chapter 23 again. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even to the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naharam to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. So very strong language there about Moabites, Deuteronomy 23. That's before they get into the land. But then think, that same kind of language is there after the exile. The book of Nehemiah says, moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. So you've got the strong language. How do we resolve that? So now chat with the person next to you. Why can Ruth be included if the prohibitions against foreign marriage are so strong? Does anyone want to speak to this? I'll just open up to the floor in general. Yes.
The problem isn't specifically that they're foreign.
Right.
The problem is that they follow foreign gods other than Yahweh.
Yeah.
So when they marry them, you're going to lead them astray. But Ruth has effectively revoked her Moabiteness by following God.
Yes, I think that is exactly right. And you see that over here in this Nehemiah reading. The problem that he's talking about over here is that the children are speaking the wrong language and following the wrong God. They haven't been brought up in God's ways, reading the Old Testament, people of faith. That's the big issue. And Ruth has really been shown to be a true Israelite, an Israelite of Israelites, where she's renounced foreign gods. She's shown undying loyalty. She's a hard worker. She's done everything right. And it's not about race. It's about religion, really. So she's a person of true Israelite religion. We might still have a question about the Deuteronomy passage, because people are welcomed in, but what about this thing where it's saying to the 10th generation? And that seems to apply more to men, I think. So you can't enter into the assembly, especially into the army, to the 10th generation. And obviously that's reckoned through the male line. And Ruth is not a man, she's a Levirate spouse. And so she can be in David's line, and that's not a problem. That's not a breach of Deuteronomy chapter 23. So these are the reasons why, even though these texts seem so very stark, it's absolutely fine for Ruth to be there. It's not breaking the rule about the 10 generations, and it's not breaking the rule really about prohibition against foreign women. The point isn't that they're foreign, but that they have foreign gods. And so what we see over here is God's providential care to welcome in Ruth. The problems that we saw at the beginning of the book are starting to be solved. That now Ruth has a husband, Ruth has a home. God really cares for her, and he's looking after her. And more than that, he's welcomed her right into the very midst of the people of God and into the heart of his plan. And this points us to this bigger principle, which is God's big plan is to bless the people of the whole world. And we remember that back in Genesis chapter 11, that God promised Abraham that he was going to bless all nations through him at the beginning of the Bible story. Remember, at the end of the Bible story, we've got people from all nations. Revelation chapter 7 says, "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" Well, this is possible because of redemption, because of the price that Jesus paid. The outcast, the foreigner, the undeserving, those who are guilty of idolatry, those people can be welcomed in. People just like us, people from every nation in the world. So the outsider is welcomed in, and then as well as that, the future is secured. The women say, "Praise be to the Lord, who's this day not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who's better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Here we see the completion of the transformation in Naomi's life. Remember at the beginning, she described herself as coming back empty, not having a husband, not having a son. Well, here we see that she does have a son, and the family line is going to be secured. But in a sense, even better than that is Ruth. Ruth is described as being better than 7 sons. God's amazing gift to Naomi is the woman who was by her side on the road back to Bethlehem all that time. And so the tone of the passage has changed in chapter 1, where Naomi had this note of bitterness, perhaps anger, frustration at what had happened. And now at this point in the story, there is this note of praise. Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. That problem that Naomi had of protection and securing the family line of Elimelech, this has been solved. The future is secured. But it's also part of this much bigger plan to secure the future through the guardian redeemer who is Jesus Christ. And so wonderfully, the genealogy links into the bigger story of the Bible. So now's a chance for you to think about that. Look at the genealogy here and then read Matthew chapter 1 and answer the question, how does the genealogy connect? And it'd be great to hear from someone just about how the genealogies are connecting.
They're very similar, aren't they? They kind of overlap quite a lot, but then you've got then you have Rahab in there as well. Interesting.
Yes, yeah. So I think aside from the specific details, just obviously that God's providence connects through to the Lord Jesus Christ. And at this stage, they don't know all of those details about where it's going in the future. But we, with the benefit of hindsight, can see God's providence linking the outsider, linking the tragic stories into God's big master plan of salvation for the world. And that's a really encouraging thing. And then I think another smaller thing to note is just the number of generations that are included here. There might be bits that are missed out, but it is notable that there are 10, and the number 10 turns up a few times in the book of Ruth. And obviously the number 10 is the number that's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 23. So it's almost as though it's showing to us that there are no skeletons in the closet for David's genealogy. Samuel's written this partly to show us that David, God's chosen king and the greatest king, is a worthy king, and we don't need to be concerned about his background. But this shows us here 10 generations. And yes, Ruth is in there, but Ruth is shown to be a true Israelite, someone who is worthy, someone who is of good character. And so this story, the wonderful story of Ruth, links into, of course, the big story. And we've been thinking that right the way through, God's kindness and God's providence, that we do live in a world that's under the curse, the Genesis 3 curse. And that means that there's brokenness. That also means that there's sin. When we turn away from God and sin, that always leads to pain. But God's plan in allowing pain into this world is always to restore us and bring us back to him. Wonderfully, that's what we saw for Naomi. And when she came back to the Lord, he started to use the bad decisions that she had made for good. And the big way that he did that was by putting Ruth by her side. Then in chapter 2, we saw something about how God shows his loving kindness in practical ways through his providential care, arranging the little details. She just so happened to be in Boaz's field. But also through his protective word that he had instructed God's people to look after the widows. And even though some people weren't doing that, there were individuals who were like Boaz. And Boaz and Ruth are examples of how believers can be agents of God's kindness when they act selflessly and in obedience, and how that can bring blessing and transformation to others. And remember, at the end of chapter 2, we saw just a glimmer of hope in Naomi's constitution. She changed from seeming so bitter in chapter 1 to already the permafrost, so to speak, had started to thaw by the end of chapter 2. But obviously, that's not enough in and of itself. It's not just enough to have general kindness. What people who are in real need require is a redeemer. And Naomi says that at the end of chapter 2. Praise the Lord, he's a redeemer. We need this redeemer. And so in chapter 3, she moves towards the redeemer. We've got questions about how she moves towards the redeemer. But nevertheless, we see it fits into God's big providential plan. We can look past some of the details that seem questionable to see the motivation, which is good. And eventually, Boaz and Ruth are able to be linked together. But that only is possible through redemption, which is costly. But that costly redemption means that outsiders can be welcomed in and that a future can be secured. One of the things that we see in the book of Ruth is God's kindness through flawed people. And we've been saying how that was the case for perhaps for some of Naomi's plans, that even though her plans weren't perfect, Nevertheless, they were used by God in a right way. And that is a great reminder to us when we see what other people are doing, we don't entirely agree, to try and look beyond some of the details to the motivation and the way that it's been used by God. But the big thing that we see in the book, of course, is redemption. And that turns up in a way that's quite unlike other books of the Bible.